This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, the editor-in-chief at FanDuel and at numberfire.com, and this is episode 437 of the Late Round Podcast, one of the many shows that are part of the FanDuel Podcast Network. Thanks for tuning in. Quarterback was strong on last week's show. I talked up Joe Burrow and Baker Mayfield, and both came through with strong performances. Teddy Bridgewater was fine too. I really liked Antonio Gibson. He balled out, but I did miss on Joshua Kelly as sort of a deeper player of flex play. And then at wide receiver, I was right to like T. Higgins. Christian Kirk came through, but I missed on Juju Smith-Schuster. That was one of those scenarios where it would be great if he did well, but he was too tough to trust given the evidence from this season. At least if you've got Juju, you know that he's not dead yet. So a solid week. Let's move on to week 8. Before doing so, though, I wanted to remind you guys to check out this week's FanDuel Podcast Network Listener League. Like every week, it's a $5 3-max entry contest that's completely rake-free. So you can spend up to $15 on 3 lineups and not have to pay any rake. This week, there's $1,500 up for grabs. For more, visit fanduel.com/league/listener league. Eligibility restrictions apply. One streaming option this week is a guy that I talked about on the 15 Transaction Show earlier in the week, but that's Jimmy Garoppolo. The Seahawks have been the second best matchup for opposing quarterbacks this year when looking at adjusted fantasy points allowed. And they've now allowed a top 12 QB1 performance in all but one matchup this season. That one matchup was Kirk Cousins in week 5. He's the only quarterback who scored fewer points against the Seahawks than his season-long average, and it was by less than a point. This game has a pretty high 53-point over-under, too. Jimmy G seems to be undervalued right now, according to the consensus. You could also look at 2 quarterbacks from the same game this week, and that game is the Raiders and Browns. Of course, I like the quarterbacks in like the Titans and Bengals game more, but Derek Carr and Baker Mayfield are reasonable streaming options. Reason 1 being that it's projected to be a fairly high-scoring game. There's a 52.5-point over-under over on FanDuel Sportsbook. But let's look specifically at Carr. Like I mentioned on the 15 Transaction Show, Carr's probably been better than you realize this year. He's a high-end QB2 in points per game, and his range of points scored has been 13.6 in week 1 to about 24 in week 5. So he's had a decent floor-ceiling combo. He's scored an average of 20 points per game since facing the Panthers in that week 1 contest. Now he gets the Browns. I already mentioned that the game's over-under is fairly high, but Cleveland's also been the third most advantageous matchup for quarterbacks in terms of adjusted fantasy points allowed. So Carr absolutely works this week. And then with Mayfield, as I noted on the 10 Trends show, there is regression coming. It'll come across the rest of the season. He won't maintain his 7.6% touchdown rate more than likely. That alone doesn't make him a bad play this week, though. The game environment and the scoring environment should be favorable, and like Carr, Mayfield's got a good matchup against Vegas because they rank as the 8th best matchup for opposing quarterbacks. So I like both of those guys as streamers. Now, on the flip side of things, I'm really worried about Ben Roethlisberger this week. The Ravens have been pretty average against quarterbacks this year when adjusted for strength of opponent, but they're also coming off of their bye. That's a little bit scary. The Steelers have been good at limiting pressure this year on Ben Roethlisberger, but they haven't been tested like Baltimore can test them. Baltimore's been pressuring quarterbacks at the second highest rate in the league. Pittsburgh is the only team with a higher pressure rate. So there is some worry there. I would be fine playing the streamers over Big Ben this week. We've got a revenge game, folks. Le'Veon Bell is facing his old Jets team, and I'm here for it. I'm here to throw out all the numbers-driven analysis and say that Bell is going to go ham against his old team this week. In all seriousness, though, it's a good spot for Bell. The Chiefs are almost 20-point favorites against the Jets right now, according to FanDuel Sportsbook, so we'll see a positive game script more than likely for this Chiefs offense. The Jets are a favorable matchup, and with Bell and CEH not having extremely different peripheral numbers last week, where Bell had just 2 fewer carries and ran just 4 fewer routes, I don't think he's a bad play this week as an RB2 type. Now, in that same game is LaMichael Pirine. Pirine saw a 50% running back rush share this past week to go along with a 13.7% target share. That was an increase of about 17% in running back rush share and 6% in target share week over week. Considering Frank Gore didn't even see a single target last week, Ryan is likely to be on the field a lot in a negative game script against Kansas City. He's going to be the team's primary pass catching back. I think that aspect of his game makes him an intriguing play. I want to take a second today and talk about Ronald Jones versus Leonard Fournette. Right now, they're both top 25 options on Fantasy Pros, but Fournette is almost 10 spots below Rojo. But I don't think there should be that big of a difference in PPR formats. Like I said on the 10 Trends show, Fournette was used as the receiving back this past week. The Bucs should have a positive game script against the Giants, sure. But the difference in ground game work wasn't that significant between Jones and Fournette this past week, with a 54% to 46% running back rush share split. I'm also nervous that this game gets out of hand, and that Fournette will be the closer. We've seen that this season already. So I'd have the two closer. I'm a little bit higher on Fournette and lower on Rojo this week. Now, another player that I'm a little bit lower on versus the consensus is J.K. Dobbins. I know Mark Ingram is banged up, and I'm excited for Dobbins too. We should be excited for Dobbins. He's a really good prospect. My hesitation is that, number one, Gus Edwards saw a lot of work the last time that we saw the Ravens. He had half of the team's running back rushes, and Dobbins had a 32% share. Dobbins is the pass catcher between these two guys, but Pittsburgh's been pretty good at limiting running back receptions. They've allowed the least receptions to that position all season long in the NFL. We know the Steelers can stop the run well too. So I view him more as a lower end RB3 rather than the higher end one or a mid-range one that people are currently ranking him as. Chris Godwin is out this week, which means Mike Evans is definitely in play. I mentioned the splits earlier this week with and without Godwin, but without Godwin this year, Evans has averaged over 21 PPR points per game and a 22.8% target share per game. With Godwin, it's a 14 PPR point per game drop. He gets the Giants this week, which means James Bradberry. And James Bradberry's been great this year. But what I'm intrigued by is that Evans played over 60% of his snaps from the slot against Vegas this past week. Bradberry's only played 22 snaps from that area of the field this year, according to Pro Football Focus. So I would start Evans this week despite these recent performances. I don't know if any of you were on the fence, but I figured I would mention it. I wouldn't be spooked by Marquise Brown this week either. You see what I did there? This is apparently a Halloween-themed show. But Brown has a 26% target share on the season. That's great, and we know he's a big play threat. He's seen 17 targets of 15 or more air yards this year, which is the 6th highest in the league, and he's already had his bye. Well, not only are the Steelers a better matchup than most would think, having allowed the 3rd most adjusted fantasy points to the wide receiver position, but they've also given up the 3rd most receptions on balls that traveled 15 or more air yards. So Brown, to me, is actually a pretty good option. I also like Rashard Higgins a lot this week, who I talked up on the 15 Transactions episode. He had 6 catches for 110 yards in relief of OBJ and his torn ACL, and he accounted for 21% of Cleveland's targets. Now he gets a plus matchup against Vegas in a game with a strong over-under. So I like Higgins a lot, and I still think he's going to surprise some people with how productive he can be without OBJ. No team has seen a higher percentage of the targets that they face go to the slot this year than the New England Patriots. So enter Cole Beasley, who's seen 28% and 29.3% of Buffalo's targets over the last 2 weeks. John Brown's being banged up can help, but don't sleep on Beasley just because New England's a super tough matchup. The matchup within the matchup shows that Beasley should give you a decent floor this week. Now, on the other side of things, Mike Williams is a decent enough matchup this week, and we know he's got the ability to make a splash play or two. So he has decent upside every single week. But that doesn't mean that he should be ranked as a locked-in wide receiver 3, which he currently is. The only game where Williams actually did anything in fantasy this year was in that Week 5 game against the Saints, where he saw 25% of the team's targets, and he had 109 receiving yards and 2 touchdowns. Otherwise, he's been the wide receiver 38, the wide receiver 104, 99, and 95 in weekly scoring. And keep in mind, in that Saints game, Keenan Allen left early. I just don't know how you can confidently play him ahead of someone like Hollywood Brown. That doesn't make that much sense to me. Anything can happen, but Brown is a much better play in my eyes. And then there's Darius Slayton. The matchup against Tampa Bay is below average, and I've got a little bit of fear with Slayton given Sterling Shepard's back in the mix. Last week, Slayton saw his target share drop below 14% for the first time all season. During the 4 weeks without Sterling Shepard, Slayton averaged a target share of 25.5%. With Shepard this year, that share has been under 18%. I know Slayton's matchup wasn't great last week, but I'm not all that in love with the situation right now. Richard Rodgers is absolutely in play this week once again. He saw 19.5% of Philly's targets last week with both Zach Ertz and Dallas Goedert out of the lineup, and he ran 31 routes. He saw all but one of the team's tight end targets. In a plus matchup this week, he's a super solid streamer. As is Harrison Bryant. Bryant ran ahead of David Njoku in week 7 with a routes run total of 17-12, and he played more snaps too. He had a 17.9% target share as a result. It sounds like Austin Hooper could be out again this week, and if that happens, Bryant is a strong option. I'm only going to mention the Chargers as a defense this week because they're still available in a whole bunch of Yahoo leagues, but they're facing the Broncos, a team with number 1, one of the lower implied team totals of the week, and number 2, the team that's allowed the second most adjusted fantasy points to opposing defenses. They've been pressured at a much higher than average rate this year too, so I would expect there to be a nice floor for sacks from the Chargers D. And then the defense that I mentioned on the 15 transaction show is the Tennessee Titans, and they definitely work as a streamer this week. I know the over-under in that game against Cincinnati is high or relatively high, but the Bengals have allowed one of the highest sack rates in the league, and they're tied with Philly for having allowed the most sacks. Tennessee hasn't been that great at getting to opposing quarterbacks this year, but they should be able to get to Joe Burrow a couple of times in this matchup if they end up seeing the positive game script that they're projected to see defensively. That's going to do it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you've yet to subscribe to the Late Round Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter @LateRoundQB. Thanks, everyone. I'll talk to you tomorrow with the weekly mailbag show.